Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm your host, Ryan Coonerty. As always, a reminder that An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports some of the most thoughtful and innovative voices in American politics. I've been a member of New Deal for years, both when I was mayor of Santa Cruz and now on the Board of Supervisors for Santa Cruz County. You can find us at newdealleaders.org or wherever podcasts are found.
Welcome to An Honorable Profession. I'm Debbie Cox Bultan, CEO of the New Deal. We're proud to support so many of the inspiring leaders you hear on this podcast. In this episode, I love talking with New Deal leader, Connecticut Representative Caroline Simmons, who at 34 was just elected to her fourth term in the State House. In Hartford, Caroline's been a passionate and effective advocate for small business and entrepreneurs, mothers, children, and more. She and I talked about how it felt watching Joe Biden and Kamala Harris being sworn into office last week, how other historic events like 9/11 and the Sandy Hook tragedy shaped her own journey into public service, and what we can learn about uniting the country from her marriage. Caroline Simmons, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Glad to be with you.
First, I just want to congratulate you on being reelected to your fourth two-year term in the Connecticut House of Representatives in November. Really excited to see that for you, and congrats.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Debbie.
Yeah, so let's start, Caroline. We're talking actually in a really historic week. This week, obviously, President Biden and Kamala Harris were sworn in at the inauguration, and we've had a couple of their first days. So I'm just kind of curious, how are you feeling about where we are in the direction of the country here?
Yeah, I am so hopeful and inspired by everything that happened this week. The inauguration was so moving, and I thought President Biden's message of unity and healing and coming together was exactly what we needed at this moment in time. And just, my goodness, how historic it was to see the first woman vice president getting sworn in. That moved me to tears. And it was just such a historic moment for our country. And I think we're so lucky to have President Biden and Vice President Harris's leadership, especially at this moment in time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the woman vice president. I cried a lot this week myself. It was really something to see. Of course, I had the thought too, to be honest, about I can't believe it's 2021 and this is the first time, but it was very exciting to see for sure.
Indeed, long overdue.
Long overdue. I think your first job out of college, Caroline, was actually working on the Obama transition team. So I'm curious about what you can tell us from that experience about kind of how things are, get up and running in the early days of a new administration.
Yeah. And it was, a really exciting time after the campaign concluded in 2008, getting to work on the transition team. I worked on the agency review team where we were in charge of, meeting with the previous administration's employees at each agency and getting briefed by them on and up to speed on homeland security issues, which is where I ended up having the fortune of getting to work under the Obama-Biden administration. And it's a really exciting time. I think, the first 100 days are always, such an important opportunity for any new president to be able to get their agenda passed. And President Biden and Vice President Harris haven't wasted any time with the incredible, robust executive orders they've already signed on the first day. I think this is such an exciting time where they're really able to get initiatives through, and particularly with having control of both houses of Congress and the Senate, it's a really opportune time to get their agenda through. So yeah, and I think unfortunately this transition was a really dark moment for our country, and I'm so happy that democracy prevailed and that there's light at the end of the tunnel now with this new administration in place, so they can get to work helping people across our country who are struggling with this economic and health crisis we're facing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Speaking of your time at DHS, I think you've had a really interesting journey into public service. And in fact, in getting ready for this, I saw that I think you were president of your high school to start. That must have been the first office or one of the first offices you ran for. Is that right? And what did you run on a platform for that position, or what prompted you to run for in student government?
Yes. So, it was actually the second office I ran for. When I first ran in ninth grade, I lost miserably my first election to student government. And so I always tell students when I'm talking to them that if they fail the first time, don't give up, because sometimes it takes a couple runs to win. But what really prompted me was the 9/11 attacks, which happened in 10th grade, the second week of high school, sitting in history class, and our principal told us that our country was under attack and that 2 planes had struck the World Trade Center towers. And I remember just, my high school was 30 minutes from Manhattan, and we all just watched in horror as over 3,000 innocent lives were lost that day. And I think it really woke us all up to the threats that we face as a country, and kind of again the threats we saw during this transition of how fragile our democracy is. And so I knew in that moment that I wanted to get involved in public service in some way. And so that's what led me to run for student government and to really try to get involved in our local school community. I remember that, despite all the devastation and horror of 9/11, it was this moment of unity for our country where, people came together and, people were lining up to donate blood and lining up to serve in the military and going into the city to volunteer at Ground Zero. And I felt like it was this really inspiring moment for our country where we came together after that crisis. And I think that really motivated me to want to serve in some way.
I love that. And I really love the message about trying again, too. I think that people don't realize how many people who were in elected office, ran at some point and didn't win or, weren't successful, and how you just got to pick yourself up and dust yourself off and keep going, just like so in so many areas of life, right? So I appreciate that message. You went on after high school to college, and you studied government at Harvard. It's interesting to hear your first answer about the high school student government, because maybe there's some threads here, I suspect. But you studied abroad in Egypt and got your MA in Middle East Studies, right? And then ended up at the Department of Homeland Security. So what was it that drove you in that direction to want to work in security and national affairs?
It was connected to the 9/11 attacks and really wanting to get more involved in foreign policy and working with international partners to protect our country from harm, so that would never happen again. That was really the motivation. And I initially had this dream of being a CIA agent. It was about the time that those Bourne Identity movies had come out with Matt Damon, and I had this dream that I could become the CIA agent and help solve all the problems. I didn't end up making the cut for the CIA, but ended up at Homeland Security, which was such a rewarding place to work alongside, all the men and women who are on the front lines protecting our air, land, and sea borders from a range of threats, everything from cyber threats to terrorist threats to natural disasters. We're under the purview of our department. And then even international work within our department, we had an Office of International Affairs. And I worked on the Middle East team, where we focused on training our counterparts in the Middle East on things like border security, airport security. And the idea was really pushing out our borders beyond the US and to try to stop threats overseas before they came to our country. And, that was one of the failures highlighted in the 9/11 Commission report. And so that was something we worked hard on. So yeah, that's really what kind of led me down that path.
That's so interesting. I'm super fascinated that you were in counterterrorism. And I saw that one of the things that you mentioned a little bit is kind of this rise of violent extremism and working on that issue. I'm curious about, back to kind of what happened in the last few weeks in our own country. What were your thoughts about some of the, domestic terrorism and the rise of white supremacy here at home with that experience that you've had?
Yeah, two things come to mind. I think one is, since we, really were successful in defeating and dismantling Al-Qaeda overseas, we really did see a shift to more homegrown terrorism. And that was one thing our department worked on, was, better intelligence coordination among federal, state, and local partners, and really, working with community partners to address homegrown extremism and domestic terrorism. And what we saw on the Capitol that day was a failure in all that progress we made on intelligence coordination. I think, both from the perspective of the threat of that pro-Trump mob being underestimated despite the intelligence in the preceding days, and then also in terms of the preparedness and response, of the Capitol Police, working with local law enforcement partners in DC and working with the National Guard to protect the Capitol was a real failure. And so I think we have significant work to do, and I'm so hopeful with the new administration on board that they will be taking a close look at that to make sure that won't ever happen again.
Yeah, indeed. And I do think there's so much, that needs to happen in terms of federal, state, and local coordination that may have not been what it should be in the last few years. So I'm optimistic about that as well. After the DHS, you came home to Stamford and to run for the state legislature. I think in 2014, you ran against an incumbent Republican. Did you always know that you wanted to run for elected office after those early stints in high school, or and how did that kind of seat? What made your decision to come run for that seat?
Yeah, so I always have loved politics, and growing up, my parents, at the dinner table, we were always, bickering about politics. My dad is a Republican, my mom's a Democrat, and, just grew up kind of hearing their stories about growing up in the 60s and, being part of the anti-Vietnam War protests and the women's liberation movements and civil rights movement. And it was always, really inspired by politics and government as a way to, make a difference and help fix challenges that we face in our country. So always kind of had that political bug, but I didn't know if I definitely wanted to run for office or, whether just kind of working behind the scenes in government was the better route. But actually in the fourth year that I was at Homeland Security, there were tragically a series of mass shootings that happened that year. And they were in Oak Creek, Tucson, Aurora, and then the fourth one that culminated that year was in Newtown, Connecticut, the horrific shooting of school children at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And I just remember watching from my desk, how horrifying that shooting was, and just, crying at my desk and, praying that finally meaningful action would be taken at the federal level on gun violence prevention. And, watched in the weeks that followed that, Congress was still just, had so much gridlock and nothing was, able to be achieved at the federal level. And I really, saw this kind of shift to, they call state legislatures the laboratories of innovation, and so much good policy making gets done at the state level before it makes its way to the federal level. And so I was really impressed kind of watching from afar what my home state in Connecticut passed in the wake of that shooting. One of the most comprehensive gun bills passed the legislature in Connecticut, and Newtown was 30 minutes from where I grew up. And so I think it really shook our community. And the incumbent that I ended up running against in that race was, one of the only Republicans in Fairfield County who voted against that bill. And so that was a big motivating reason for running, and just, wanting to be a voice for gun safety and reducing gun violence in our community. And also just the broader goal of, wanting to impact policy and help people at the state and local level, where I think you can really make a difference at the grassroots level and in helping make people's lives better. Absolutely.
I mean, you've given me goosebumps. Yes, it affected your community. And of course, it affected all of us too. I mean, I was remembering my youngest son was a kindergartner when Sandy Hook happened. And I just remember standing outside, being there to pick him up, when I heard about what had happened. And I just, was sobbing. And to your point, the inaction that followed was, just horrifying. It still is, and so, but I didn't know that actually that was such a motivating factor for you. And I love that. It is so important, the response that can happen at the state and local level, often in the face of federal inaction. So thank you for that. You mentioned, Caroline, your dad and mom being of different political parties. I think your dad served actually in the administration of George W. Bush. One of my favorite things when I was thinking about talking to you was I was excited to get to talk to you about this aspect of your life, because not only do you have parents that were different political parties, you're married to a former Republican legislator who I believe you met through your work with the Bipartisan Young Legislators Caucus. I just think that that's so fascinating, particularly now when everyone feels like there are these divides that are almost insurmountable, that you have, lived your whole life, loving and working with people across party lines. And I'm kind of curious about your work with the Bipartisan Legislative Caucus and what the goal was there, and also what lessons you would give people who are, desperate to make connections with people who don't always agree with them. And, and this whole idea that you started our conversation with about kind of unity and healing the country.
Absolutely. Yes. It's funny. It was actually the last thing I was expecting when I got to Hartford was, to meet the love of my life. It's not what you expect to find when you get to state government, but it was such a pleasant surprise. And you're right. We met he started this bipartisan Young Legislators Caucus, and I think you had to be under 30 or 35. And so there were only a few of us in it at the time. And he and I kind of just hit it off as friends. And then we served on committees together and got to work on bipartisan legislation. And it's funny, at first when we started dating, we sort of kept it secretive because we were so worried what our, colleagues and kind of party leaders were going to think, because I think you're right. There's just so much divisiveness right now. And, I think particularly with party politics, people kind of put each other in boxes and say, oh, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're bad, or you represent these things. And I think the reality is, we don't fit into these boxes. I think we have so much more in common, and we have, overlapping policies that we agree with. And that's one thing my husband and I try to always focus on is, we both love our state and we love our country, and we want to fix these challenges. We may, differ on the best way to get there at times, but I think we try to always have that respect for each other's intentions, that we both care about having those, positive outcomes. We don't always do the best job. We certainly have had heated dinner debates as well, like my parents did growing up. But I think it's so important in this day and age too, as you're saying, Debbie, with all the division we're seeing. And I think just the lack of faith in government among our population, it's, at an all-time low. I think, Congress, I read recently, it's, only 13% approve of the job Congress is doing. And I think people have really just lost faith in the system. And I think partisan politics and the gridlock that we see is a big part of that. And so I think we need to do a much better job of reaching out across the aisle and listening to one another and respecting one another. And I always say that instead of attacking each other, we should attack the problems we're facing and put our energy into coming up with creative bipartisan solutions.
Absolutely. Will you indulge me for a second? I did not know this story about you until I was getting ready for our conversation today. You have to just briefly tell us about the proposal, because it's so cute.
Oh, of course. You'd make my husband stay if he heard this, because he spent so long planning this. But he knows I love reading the newspaper every morning. And one of our things we used to do when we were dating is like just go to breakfast and read the papers. And he always reads the Wall Street Journal, and I always read the New York Times, and we kind of would debate back and forth the issues. And so he decided to propose with a full page advertisement in our local newspaper in Stamford, the Stamford Advocate. And it's on the back page. And so I usually the weather's on that page. So I always kind of like flip to the back to check the weather that day. And I had to do a double take and I was kind of in shock when I saw it. I was like, wait, what is this? It said, "Dear Caroline, will you marry me?" on the back page. And so it was very sweet and meaningful. And of course, our local paper loved it too, because they're starved for revenues. So it was really special.
I love that story. Thank you for sharing that. That is the cutest thing. Good for him. He gets major kudos. I want to go back, Caroline, to when you ran for office that first time. You're a millennial. You dated yourself with some of telling us where you were at certain historic events throughout this conversation. So I think certainly at the time you were the youngest woman serving in the state. You may still be. I'm kind of interested in that experience and how being a young woman in the legislature, how that was, how you were treated, how you felt, how you were able to get things done, just kind of your experience.
Yeah. So I think this was definitely, one of the challenges I faced in my campaign running as a young woman. I think I faced kind of criticism from, older leaders in my community that, you don't have the experience and you need to, put in your time. And I think that's a challenge that all young candidates face. But one thing I found is that I think it's actually so helpful to have new blood and new ideas, brought to our legislatures. They need that infusion of kind of new creative energy, because I think by the time you're in there a certain amount of time, or, when you stay too long, I think you kind of lose that, and you lose that kind of innovation and those new bright ideas. So that's one thing I've always tried to bring since I've been there. I do feel we're fortunate in Connecticut that we do have, leaders that are really supportive of women, and, particularly women with young kids. I've found our speaker's been really supportive of, times I've had to, go pump in my office, or I've had to leave early, due to childcare reasons. I think, they're really supportive, but we have so much work to do in terms of getting more women in office and in government. Only about 30% of our legislature is female right now. And we still have very few young moms. I think because of how challenging it can be to get up to Hartford and to have to be there, overnight sometimes for bill debates, with kids at home, it can be really challenging. So I think we still have a lot of work to do there to make our state government more friendly to women and to working moms.
Absolutely. And I think that's true across the country. It has been so heartening to see so many women and other, people of color and just other historically underrepresented groups in government make such strides over the last couple cycles. But I agree, we just can't do enough to make sure that so many different voices are represented in our government. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done in the legislature. You've really developed a national reputation on a bunch of issues, but in particular, I was hoping to talk a little bit about the work you've done on entrepreneurship and small business support. You were co-chair of the Commerce Committee. You actually worked in the legislature, but also held positions outside the legislature, like your work with the Women's Business Development Council. You passed an entrepreneur's learning permit bill that NewDEAL has highlighted a number of times to streamline services and provide support for entrepreneurs. I'm curious, particularly with COVID now, this has become such a major issue of trying to support small businesses and entrepreneurs. Tell us a little bit about how you got into that work and what you're doing now.
Yeah, and thanks so much for your kind words before. And I have to thank the NewDEAL too for all of your support. And it's so great to get to collaborate with colleagues and counterparts from across the country on innovative bill ideas. That's so helpful. So thanks for all of your support and all that the NewDEAL does. Yeah, so as you said, supporting small businesses and jobs is, our top priority right now with all the devastating economic effects of this pandemic. So many businesses have had to close their doors at no fault of their own during this pandemic, and they've really made enormous sacrifices to protect the health and safety of their employees and customers, and have been forced to shut down. And so, from March of 2020 to now, we've been focused on helping keep them alive through providing grant and low interest loan programs. Working with the SBA and federal partners on getting PPP and EIDL loans out to small businesses. We focused a lot too on women and minority owned businesses who have been hit especially hard by the pandemic, and then also focusing on small businesses within industries that have been hit especially hard, like our hospitality industry, our tourism industry, our retail industry, and our restaurants. So we will continue to be focusing on it this session. And then, prior to COVID, we were also working to kind of remove red tape and make it easier to start a business in Connecticut. So the entrepreneurial learner's permit bill that you mentioned was one of the ideas we put forward, where we said a new business could start for free, and we would reimburse them on all the kind of permitting fees and licensing costs associated with starting a business, just to make it easier to start up. We want to make Connecticut as friendly as possible to new businesses and entrepreneurs, because they're the job creators. 2/3 of all new jobs are created by small businesses, and so we wanted to make our state a more welcoming place. But we still have significant work to do on that front, and to help these businesses survive this difficult winter we have ahead.
Absolutely. And I know that, when you were talking about running this last time, obviously you've talked about COVID being the paramount in terms of getting it under control so that you can get things turned back around in your state, like is true across the country. I know so many states and localities are struggling to kind of get their vaccine plan up and running and stop the spread, as well as things like with small business and entrepreneurs and other safety net issues. So how do things look in Connecticut, and what are you working on? How as a legislator are you able to kind of address some of those issues?
We just started our session January 6th, and we are actually today is our bill deadline, where we're submitting bills. And I think all of us are kind of looking at it with a COVID lens in terms of how can we support the most vulnerable who are being affected by this pandemic. And so, we're really focused on issues like housing, on healthcare, and addressing the racial inequities we've seen exacerbated by this pandemic. We're focused on job creation. We had over 500,000 people in our state filed for unemployment. So how can we get them back into good paying job opportunities? And then we're also focused on education and making sure our students and teachers can safely be in the classroom, and that we close the digital divide so that all students have access to remote learning opportunities. So those are kind of some of the top issues that we're focused on.
Caroline, just continuing a little bit about kind of your legislative priorities. I know the work that you've been doing most recently outside the legislature has involved mental health issues, particularly, I think, for new mothers. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? And is that something you'll be working on in the legislature this session as well?
Yes. So my outside job is I work at the Yale School of Medicine at a policy lab called Elevate, which works to advance maternal mental health policies in order to lift families out of poverty. And that's been a really rewarding experience that has really helped inform me on policies we need at the state level to advance maternal mental health. And actually one bill that I introduced with a group of my fellow legislators is a bill that extends Medicaid coverage for mothers beyond 60 days postpartum and provides a year of coverage, because one of the challenges we see is after 60 days postpartum, often mothers lose their Medicaid eligibility. And that's such a critical period, both to supporting a mother's, mental and physical health, but also to making sure that well-child visits are being attended. And so ACOG and a number of kind of national health leaders are recommending that Medicaid coverage be extended to 1 year postpartum. So that's something we are introducing and hoping to get traction on. And I think that there's so much work we need to do in terms of supporting maternal health. We know that the U.S. has seen maternal mortality rates rising. We've seen the rates of preterm births increasing. And a lot of these challenges are preventable if we can just put in place better maternity care policies and better support for prenatal care for mothers and families. And so that's definitely something I'm going to be continuing to focus on.
That's so fantastic. Thanks, Caroline. As we wrap up here, I would love to ask you a question that I've become fond of lately about any favorite books you have, particularly things that relate to leadership or history or kind of the times in which we find ourselves. Do you have any good book recommendations for us?
Yes, actually, one leadership book, which I absolutely love, and I'm just finishing up, is called Leadership in Turbulent Times. I don't know if you've read that, but it compares kind of Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and LBJ's leadership style by Doris Goodwin. And it's just a really fascinating read. And I think so relevant now to the crisis we're facing, because it talks about how FDR handled the Great Depression and how LBJ handled the Civil Rights Movement, and how Lincoln, handled the Emancipation Proclamation, and Theodore Roosevelt handled their labor strikes, and how these different leaders use their skill sets to get us through different crises. And I think it's really applicable to what we're facing today. So definitely recommend that book.
I love it. And I have to tell you that Zach Walz in Iowa, the new Senate Minority Leader who was the last interview I did, also recommended that book. So I'm going to say that clearly should be New Deal leader and New Deal friend reading. I'm a huge Doris Kearns Goodwin fan, actually. I think that she's a treasure, frankly. So I'm seconding your endorsement of that book as well.
She really is a treasure, and I'm so glad to know that's great. We should definitely endorse it as a New Deal.
I'll have to start a New Deal book club, actually. I'm getting ideas here.
I love that idea.
I love it. Well, Caroline, I just can't thank you enough for taking time to talk to us today. I'm just so grateful to all of you who choose to serve in public life right now, particularly in these tough times, whether it's the pandemic and the recession and our racial equality, as well as just the need to unify and heal this country. So thank you for all you do. We're grateful for it. And I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much, Debbie. It was great to connect with you. And thanks for all that you and New Deal do as well.
Thanks for listening to An Honorable Profession. Please subscribe to hear more amazing leaders. And keep asking your elected officials to be honorable. Boots Road Group produces podcast. I'm Ryan Coonerty. And because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars were used in the making of this podcast.